whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Kaatskill Mountains. They are a dismembered branch of the great Appalachian family and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling up to a noble height and lording it over the surrounding country. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed every hour of the day produces some change in the magical hues and shapes of these mountains, and they are regarded by all the good wives far and near as perfect barometers. When the weather is fair and settled, they are clothed in blue and purple and print their bold outlines on the clear evening sky. But sometimes, when the rest of the landscape is cloudless, they will gather a hood of grey vapours about their summits, which in the last rays of the setting sun will glow and light up like a crown of glory. At the foot of these fairy mountains, the voyager may have descried the light smoke curling up from a village whose shingle roofs gleam among the trees, just where the blue tints of the upland melt away into the fresh green of the nearer landscape. It is a little village of great antiquity, having been founded by some of the Dutch colonists in the early times of the province. There were some of the houses of the original settlers, built of small yellow bricks brought from Holland, having latticed windows and gable fronts surmounted with weathercocks. In that same village and in one of these very houses there lived a simple, good-natured fellow of the name of Rip Van Winkle. He was a simple, good-natured man, a kind neighbor, and an obedient, henpecked husband. Certain it is that he was a great favourite among all the good wives of the village, who, as usual with the amiable sex, took his part in all family squabbles, and never failed whenever they talked those matters over in their evening gossipings, to lay all the blame on Dame Van Winkle. The children of the village, too, would shout with joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports, made their playthings, taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles, and told them long stories of ghosts, witches, and Indians. Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of them, hanging on his skirts, clambering on his back, and playing 1,000 tricks on him with impunity, and not a dog would bark at him throughout the neighbourhood. The great error in Rip's composition was an aversion to all kinds of profitable labour. It could not be from the want of assiduity and perseverance, for he would sit on a wet rock with a rod as long and heavy as a Tartar's lance, and fish all day without a murmur. He would carry a fowling piece on his shoulder for hours together, trudging through woods and swamps, and up hill and down dell, to shoot a few squirrels or wild pigeons. He would never refuse to assist a neighbour even in the toughest toil, and was a foremost man at all country frolics for husking Indian corn or building stone fences. The women in the village, too, used to employ him to run their errands and to do such little odd jobs as their less obliging husbands would not do for them. In a word, Rip was ready to attend to anybody's business but his own. But as to doing family duty and keeping his farm in order, he found it impossible. In fact, he declared it was of no use to work on his farm. It was the most pestilent little piece of ground in the whole country. Everything about it went wrong and would go wrong, in spite of him. His fences were continually falling to pieces. His cow would either go astray or get among the cabbages. Weeds were sure to grow quicker in his fields than anywhere else. The rain always made a point of setting in just as he had some outdoor work to do. His children, too, were as ragged and wild as if they belonged to nobody. His son Rip, an urchin begotten in his own likeness, promised to inherit the habits with the old clothes of his father. Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals of foolish, well-oiled dispositions who take the world easy, eat white bread or brown, whichever can be got with least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left to himself, he would have whistled life away in perfect contentment. But his wife kept continually dining in his ears about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Morning, noon, and night, her tongue was incessantly going, and everything he said or did was sure to produce a torrent of household eloquence. Rip's sole domestic adherent was his dog Wolf, who was as much henpecked as his master. For Dem Van Winkle regarded them as companions in idleness, and even looked upon Wolf with an evil eye, as the cause of his master's going so often astray. Poor Rip was at last reduced almost to despair, and his only alternative to escape from the labor of the farm and the clamor of his wife was to take gun in hand and stroll away into the woods. Here he would sometimes sit himself at the foot of a tree and share the contents of his wallet with Wolf, with whom he sympathized as a fellow sufferer in persecution. In a long ramble of the kind on a fine autumnal day, Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Kaatskill mountains. He was after his favorite sport of squirrel shooting, and the still solitudes had echoed and re-echoed with the reports of his gun. Panting and fatigued, he threw himself late in the afternoon on a green knoll covered with mountain herbage that crowned the brow of a precipice. He could overlook all the lower country for many a mile of rich woodland. He saw at a distance the lordly Hudson far, far below him in its majestic course, losing itself in the blue highlands. On the other side he looked down into a deep mountain glen with cliffs and scarcely lighted by the reflected rays of the setting sun. For some time Rip lay musing on this scene. Evening was gradually advancing. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance hallooing, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" He looked round but could see nothing but a crow winging its solitary flight across the mountain. He thought his fancy must have deceived him, and turned again to descend when he heard the same cry ring through the still evening air. "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" At the same time, Wolf bristled up his back and, giving a low growl, skulked back to his master's side, looking fearfully down into the glen. Rip now felt a vague apprehension stealing over him. He looked anxiously in the same direction and perceived a strange figure slowly toiling up the rocks and bending under the weight of something he carried on his back. He was surprised to see any human being in this lonely and unfrequented place, but supposing it to be someone of the neighborhood in need of his assistance, he hastened down to yield it. On nearer approach, he was still more surprised at the singularity of the stranger's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow with thick bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion, a cloth jerkin strapped round the waist and several pairs of breeches. He bore on his shoulder a stout keg that seemed full of liquor and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. Rip complied with his usual alacrity, and mutually relieving one another, they clambered up a narrow gully, apparently the dry bed of a mountain torrent. As they ascended, Rip every now and then heard long rolling peals like distant thunder that seemed to issue out of a deep ravine. Passing through the ravine, they came to a hollow like a small amphitheatre surrounded by perpendicular precipices. During the whole time, Rip and his companion had labored on in silence. On entering the amphitheatre, new objects of wonder presented themselves. On a level spot in the centre was a company of odd-looking personages playing at ninepins. They were dressed in quaint, outlandish fashion. Their visages, too, were peculiar. They all had beards of various shapes and colours. As Rip and his companion approached them, they suddenly desisted from their play and stared at him with such fixed, statue-like gaze and such strange, uncouth, lacklustre countenances that his heart turned within him and his knees smote together. His companion now emptied the contents of the keg into large flagons and made signs to him to wait upon the company. He obeyed with fear and trembling. They quaffed the liquor in profound silence and then returned to their game. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to test the beverage, which he found had much of the flavour of excellent Hollands. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and was soon tempted to repeat the draught. At length his senses were overpowered, his head gradually declined, and he fell into a deep sleep. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright sunny morning. Surely, thought Rip, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep. He looked round for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old firelock lying by him. Wolf too had disappeared. As he rose to walk, he found himself stiff in the joints and wanting in his usual activity. With some difficulty he got down into the glen. He found the gully up which he and his companion had ascended the preceding evening. But to his astonishment, a mountain stream was now foaming down it. As he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none whom he knew, which somewhat surprised him, for he had thought himself acquainted with everyone in the country round. Their dress too was of a different fashion from that to which he was accustomed. They all stared at him with equal marks of surprise, and whenever they cast their eyes upon him, invariably stroked their chins. The constant recurrence of this gesture induced Rip involuntarily to do the same, when, to his astonishment, he found his beard had grown a foot long. He had now entered the skirts of the village. A troop of straying children ran at his heels, hooting after him and pointing at his grey beard. The dogs too barked at him as he passed. The very village was altered. It was larger and more populous, and his familiar haunts had disappeared. His mind now misgave him. That flagon last night, thought he, has addled my poor head sadly. It was with some difficulty that he found the way to his own house. He found the house gone to decay. It was empty, forlorn, and apparently abandoned. He called loudly for his wife and children. The lonely chambers rang for a moment with his voice, and then all again was in silence. He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn. But it too was gone. A large rickety wooden building stood in its place with great gaping windows, some of them broken and mended with old hats and petticoats. And over the door was painted "The Union Hotel by Jonathan Doolittle." There was as usual a crowd of folk about the door, but none that Rip recollected. The poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity and whether he was himself or another man. At this critical moment, a comely woman pressed through the throng to get a peep at the grey-bearded man. "Hush, Rip!" cried she. "Hush, you little fool! The old man won't hurt you." The name of the child, the air of the mother, the tone of her voice all awakened a train of recollections in his mind. "What is your name, my good woman?" asked he. "Judith Gardiner. And your father's name?" "Ah, poor man, Rip Van Winkle was his name. But it's 20 years since he went away from home with his gun and never has been heard of since. His dog came home without him. I was then but a little girl." Rip had but one question more to ask, but he put it with a faltering voice. "Where's your mother?" "Oh, she too had died but a short time since." The honest man could not contain himself no longer. He caught his daughter and her child in his arms. "I am your father," cried he. "Young Rip Van Winkle once, old Rip Van Winkle now. Does nobody know poor Rip Van Winkle?" All stood amazed until an old woman, tottering out from among the crowd, put her hand to her brow. "Sure enough, it is Rip Van Winkle. Welcome home again, old neighbor. Why, where have you been these 20 long years?" Rip's story was soon told, for the whole 20 long years had been to him but as one night. It was old Peter Vanderdonk who recollected Rip at once and corroborated his story in the most satisfactory manner. He assured the company that it was a fact handed down from his ancestor, the historian, that the Kaatskill mountains had always been haunted by strange beings. Rip now resumed his old walks and habits. He soon found many of his former cronies and preferred making friends among the rising generation, with whom he soon grew into great favor. He used to tell his story to every stranger that arrived at Mr. Doolittle's hotel. Some always pretended to doubt the reality of it, while the old Dutch inhabitants almost gave it full credit. Even to this day they never hear a thunderstorm of a summer afternoon about the Kaatskill. But it is a common wish of all henpecked husbands in the neighborhood, when life hangs heavy on their hands, that they might have a quieting draught out of Rip Van Winkle's flagon.